Well, I think Jeff just tossed it to me, as they say in the news business, but I couldn't quite tell because I can't quite hear him. But let me just, on behalf of Pittsburgh Works Together and all the folks who are sponsoring this, welcome everybody to this webinar as they work to get Jeff's sound back on. I think that was his job and his role. But I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this program with some three outstanding lawmakers from Pennsylvania who have joined us today in this discussion of infrastructure and energy, a bipartisan discussion. And that is something that we always welcome, at least those of us who cover politics and business and economics. We're going to talk a little bit about bipartisanship in just a minute or two. But let me again welcome everybody to this webinar. I know that we've got I understand close to 200 people on this. That's amazing for this hour of the day, and it's really appreciated. I'm going to make a very brief introduction. Jeff was going to do the introductions, but I have the good fortune of knowing these folks. It's a great pleasure to recognize the Speaker of the House of Representatives of Pennsylvania, the Honorable Brian Cutler. Brian, welcome to the show, Mr. Speaker. Always good to have you here and to be part of this.
Yep, thanks for having me on this morning.
It's great to have you with us, and it's also a great pleasure to introduce my congressman. He lives right down the street from me, Congressman Conor Lamb, who represents the 18th Congressional District. Conor, thank you, sir, very much for being part of this program this morning. Really appreciate it.
Glad to be here. Good morning, everybody.
And we have State Representative Josh Kail, one of our newer members of the State House of Representatives, although I think, am I remembering correctly, Josh, second, third term now?
It's the second term.
Second term. Josh
yeah.
represents primarily Beaver County and really the energy hub of this region in so many ways. It's a great pleasure to have Josh with us. Thank you, sir, very much for being part of this today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, John.
So I don't know whether Jeff has regained his sound and wants to say a few words before I get going. Jeff, you are our host, so I'll let you go if you want. If not, I'll just keep going. Keep going. He's muted himself. So, all right, no problem at all. Well, gentlemen, thank you again for being part of this conversation. In the interest of full disclosure, Mr. Lamb is a Democrat, Mr. Kail and Mr. Cutler are Republicans. They're all fine elected officials. Again, I've had the pleasure of working with all of them from my vantage point as the money and politics editor at KDKA Television. So it's a great honor to be with all of you. But let me ask you a couple key questions as we get started here. And I want to point out to the hundreds of folks who are watching this that you are able to engage in a Q&A by using the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen here. Feel free to pose a question, and later on, I think if Jeff regains his sound, he's going to ask the questions. If not, if I see the questions, I'll ask them as well. But we want this to be interactive with all of you who are participating. So I want to begin with a very basic question, because it seems to me that infrastructure is really a nonpartisan issue. You either believe we have infrastructure problems or you think we don't, but it's not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. So let me just ask each of you, and I'm going to start with the speaker because we're going to talk both state and federal here. But I'll start with Speaker Cutler and just ask the basic question. Do you believe we have an infrastructure problem in Pennsylvania? And where do you see the greatest needs? Speaker Cutler, we'll start with you, sir.
Sure. Thank you, John. Yes, I do think that we have some serious infrastructure issues. The most obvious is probably roads, bridges, and rail when you look at that in our economy. One of the things that's often overlooked, I think, though, and should not be for our Commonwealth, is ports as well as pipelines. Those tend to be the two that are sometimes not fully explored or supported. And then lastly, internet as well. Particularly during this pandemic, I think that the need for connectivity really shown through here, both in terms of school and work for us as individuals. But specific and back to the pipelines, I think it's one of the important things I want to encourage the members out in Western PA to do is really put it in terms of the number of trucks that would be removed from the roadways if pipelines were in place. I personally think that we can safely and respond as well as provide transportation of it, because we use a lot of the, to produce energy. We use a lot of the downstream benefits to produce other items, and it's proven that it needs to get from point A to order to be processed and used. So we've got to think long term about how we're going to do that. And lastly, I'd say this: I think that the Commonwealth of Virginia actually has a really good model. They have a 100-year infrastructure plan. And that's something I think that would be wise for us to take a look at, because I know in Lancaster County, where we've really developed, one of the problems that we have now is that you can't put any further infrastructure in because of the build out of all the homes. In order to relocate or locate new roads, you would have to either through eminent domain, you'd have to condemn large swaths of land, or you'd have to go so far out around it that it really doesn't help with the congestion in the middle parts of the county. And it'd be wise for us to have a multi-decade outlook in terms of infrastructure development with roads, bridges, and pipelines.
Well, 100-year plan is definitely multi-decade. I'm going to come back to you in a little bit, Brian, to ask about solutions, but thank you for that list. Let me turn to Congressman Lamb. Congressman, from your perspective, do we have an infrastructure problem, and where do you see the greatest needs?
Yes, thank you, John. We clearly do. I think you can look at this entire debate nationally if you want, in comparison to a report that's published every couple of years by the American Society of Civil Engineers. And I point that out because I think sometimes people get so used to the two parties sniping back and forth in Washington at each other over these issues that they forget that there are actually like neutral, non-political people out there that look at these issues and can tell us something of value. So the engineers have this website, infrastructurereport.org, I think is what it's called. And they give us a grade to the nation's infrastructure and then to each state. And Pennsylvania right now is getting a C-, and the nation as a whole is getting either a C- or a D+. So it's pretty bad. They put the number of the dollar amount of work that we need to do to just go repair and maintain and upgrade everything at somewhere around $2.5 trillion before you even get to brand new things like 5G or electric vehicle charging stations or things that are new inventions. So we clearly have a lot to do. Demonstrating the bipartisan nature of this problem already. I agree with all three of the categories that Brian mentioned. We don't have great infrastructure or great internet coverage, even in portions of my district, which is not that far from the city of Pittsburgh. During the Texas freeze of a little over a month ago, natural gas prices were going crazy in Oklahoma, of course, Texas, places around there, because we don't have enough pipeline infrastructure to get cheap available natural gas from Western Pennsylvania to there in the advent of a crisis or a surge. Western Pennsylvania could have done really well in a moment like that and would have had a lot to contribute, but the pipeline infrastructure is just not there. And then you talk about ports, people forget Pittsburgh is a port. It's one of the most important inland ports in the entire country. And in fact, for those who are familiar with the Shell cracker plant, as I'm sure most people on this call are, really Shell located the cracker plant where it is for two reasons. One is the availability of all the natural gas feedstock that they use to make the plastic. The other is that the location next to the river allowed them to bring the massive construction equipment up to the site at an available cost. You can't do that if you don't have a waterway to travel on, because that stuff is too big to bring on the road and too expensive. Well, that means that the key infrastructure fact of the Shell cracker plant site is not only the gas and the pipelines, but the locks and dams that make the river navigable. And the lock that is closest to the Shell cracker plant site is called the Montgomery Lock. It is almost 100 years old, and it is literally at a 50% chance, 1 out of 2, of failing in the next 2 years. It has a giant crack in the concrete that runs from top to bottom like this. And if that thing finally cracked, it would just fall into the river like that, and it would all become non-navigable. So that huge project for our economy, all the jobs that brings with it, is threatened by something as old and seemingly simple as fixing a lock and dam. And it's probably time for our government to show that we can fix things like that.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman. Again, I'm going to come back to some of these topics in a second. Locks and dams rings true. It seems like we've heard those issues for decades. And I guess some things get done, but not, I mean, it seems like it's a patchwork when it comes to repairs there. So we'll come back and talk about that in a second. State Representative Josh Kail. Representative Kail, thank you, sir, very much again for joining us. Is there an infrastructure problem in Pennsylvania? And what do you see as some of the greatest needs?
Yeah, I agree with Conor and Brian. There's definitely an infrastructure problem in Pennsylvania. And I think, and maybe I'm a little biased coming from Beaver and Washington counties, but I think the greatest need for infrastructure investments in Western Pennsylvania. With the downstream opportunity that the Shell cracker plant is going to bring to this region, I think it's absolutely critical that we have the appropriate infrastructure. I think what Conor was talking about with the locks and dams is absolutely essential. We have an opportunity to really have a just a revolutionary impact on our job market in Western Pennsylvania and manufacturing. And it's not just Western Pennsylvania, it's also parts of West Virginia and Eastern Ohio as well, where we could bring tens of thousands of jobs to this area with the downstream opportunity. And we got to be prepared with the infrastructure, and we got to make sure that we have, that we're leveraging all the assets that we have in Pennsylvania. So I am maybe a little bit biased, but I think the state should be predominantly focused on this region for that reason. And we should leverage all of our natural resources and make sure that we get the most out of this opportunity for Western Pennsylvania.
Well, as a Western Pennsylvanian, I'm sure Congressman Lamb and most of the representatives and senators here would agree with the focus on this region, but you know, the speaker does come from a different part of the state, so it might be just a little bit different for his folks over there. But you know, it's obvious there's a consensus that we have an infrastructure problem, and each of you gentlemen have identified the same kinds of issues, frankly. And so it leads to the next question: why haven't we done anything, or at least enough, out of Harrisburg or out of Washington? And I want to start with the congressman, because obviously we have President Biden's plan, a nearly $2 trillion plan that some of the Republican operatives, I'm not saying members of Congress necessarily or senators, although some say, but they use this figure of what, 9%? They say that his plan really only X percent, it's in single digits, deals with real infrastructure, and that the rest is all social stuff. I've looked at his plan. It's hard for me to, I don't understand where they come up with that single digit percentage. There is stuff in the president's plan that deals with social issues, no doubt about it. But is there a way, in your view, Congressman, to achieve compromise in Washington on infrastructure between the parties?
Absolutely. And I think the first point of friction that we are trying to ease is this definition of sort of what counts as infrastructure and what doesn't. And I would discourage anyone from relying on the politicians at the campaign committees of either party to define what that is. I think this is a place where some common sense could go a really long way. So, you know, you ask a person living in Beaver County or Lancaster or up in Erie whether their water pipes are infrastructure, they'll say yes. Ask them whether their access to internet is infrastructure, they'll also say yes. Ask them how they fuel their car, whether it's by gas or whether it's by an electric charge is infrastructure, and they'll say yes. That's predominantly where Biden's plan is focused. But I am part of a group of 28 Democrats and 28 Republicans in the House, and we have some allies in the Senate as well. That's actually on the verge of publishing a report defining what we believe the bipartisan consensus on infrastructure is. And it includes water pipes, it includes the electrical grid, It includes transportation, but it also does include internet and electric vehicle charging and things of that nature. So it, long-term care is not necessarily the place where there's going to be bipartisan consensus, but on other things that you think of as hard physical assets that almost anyone doing business in America needs to take advantage of, we can get to it. Yes. Now, the second part of it is hard. And to answer your question of why it hasn't happened at this point, it's expensive. And it's just not easy to do things that are expensive. And I think where we are trying to keep the debate focused is the fact that these are investments and they're long-term investments. And, Biden's plan, he puts the price tag at $2 trillion. It's not like he's going to spend $2 trillion in 2021. They're going to spend a little bit of money every year over a decade, making sure that we get this right. It just so happens that right now the federal government can finance almost anything it wants at a negative interest rate. And we believe very strongly that the economy is going to grow by maybe 5% this year and pretty well next year as we come out of the pandemic. So I think if you just look at it from an investing point of view, you've got a 0 to negative interest rate and an almost guaranteed rate of return. And a lot of people who are out of work looking to get back into the workforce, you'll probably never have better conditions for an infrastructure investment than you have right now. That will not last forever. And so those of us who are arguing for a larger investment, that's why I'm doing it, because I think the conditions themselves are so fruitful.
Let me ask you, if I may, Conor, directly, did you say you have 56 members of Congress evenly split in both parties?
Yeah, we have a group that's called the Problem Solvers Caucus. And basically what we do is meet multiple times a week, every week, across a lot of the hot button issues to see if we can prove a consensus on some piece of it. And we created a working group that I'm the Democratic lead of on infrastructure. And we're about to publish a report either this week or next that will show exactly where the consensus is among this group of 56. And then we work with some people in the Senate, like Senator Manchin and Senator Romney and people of that like that. So we are really going to show that the bipartisanship on this issue is not, it's not make believe, it's not a talking point, it really exists. And if we can get people to sort of turn that into a legislative vehicle, we'll be successful.
Are you going to be able to put a price tag on the consensus that you reach?
That's our goal. And we are actually talking about that every day, not just between the two parties, but between the two chambers. My personal goal is I think we could get to somewhere around $1 trillion, give or take some on either end, defined commitment to, what you might call physical infrastructure. Right now, a lot of the Republican senators are more, kind of in the 600 to 800 billion range. Democrats are like at 1.2 in our group, and we're seeing if we can emerge there with a solid $1 trillion bipartisan proposal.
Yeah, well, good luck on that. I think I think you're making some news here, and I appreciate that very much. Let me ask the speaker here in Pennsylvania. Well, maybe I'll ask first about your reaction to what's going on in Washington, because obviously, your Republican colleagues from the state of Pennsylvania, the congressional delegation and Senator Toomey and the like. You get sort of a mixed signals out of some of them. Do you think compromise is possible in Washington on this? And would you urge that as the leader in the General Assembly in Harrisburg?
Yeah, the short answer, John, is yes. I agree with Conor. I do think that compromise is possible. Quite frankly, in Harrisburg, we've been living it for the last multiple years. And I'll go back to the last session when I was leader, and for about 18 or 19 months of the 24, we passed a record number of bills out of the House of 650 for a 2-year session. 96% of those bills were bipartisan and 64% were unanimous. And I realize those are not headlines. Everybody works together to solve problems is not a really exciting headline. But we've been able to do it in Harrisburg. I think they can do it in Washington, D.C. We would welcome it. We passed Act 89 some time ago, which is our own gas tax and infrastructure plan here. There was some different proposals about that quite frankly, we were anticipating federal money, and we were going to use that money as our gas tax increase as a match. So to the extent that they could successfully do that in Washington, D.C. now, that would be a huge benefit. To go to the issue that you had raised about why hasn't it happened yet, I think that's a very valid question. And I'm assuming that, like in Harrisburg, that it's the same in Washington as well. And that is generally everybody can agree on the problem, just like we did here this morning. We all say, yes, there's an infrastructure problem. The difficulty or the differences comes in, one, how do you solve it? And two, how do you pay for it? That's typically where those discussions will break down. I know at least here in Pennsylvania, with a large portion of our state, particularly where I live, being in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, in addition to funding, permitting is also a huge issue. The average wait time to get a permit here in South Central PA is approximately 2 to 2.5 years. And when you have to wait 2 to 2.5 years, you're not doing infrastructure projects, you're not building new businesses, you're not doing anything that you could do somewhere else. Maryland, for example, which we share the Chesapeake Bay with, their average, they have a average and a anticipated wait time of about 90 days. So, we have a natural gas fired power plant that's literally 100 yards across the border. The pipeline runs through southern Lancaster County, where I live, right by my house, but it feeds the plant and all the jobs that are just inside the Maryland border. So in addition to funding, I think we need to look at expediting permits. Again, I think you can safely do that. I think that we saw a demonstration of that out in your area with the cracker plant, where they put everything in line. They made sure that not only the permitting for the builds and everything that was needed there was set up, but they also made sure that everything leading up to it was also accessible. And we're going to need a concerted effort, both in funding as well as in paperwork reform, I think, to make this happen.
Have you talked to any of the Republican congressmen from Pennsylvania on this issue of the infrastructure proposals?
I have. I've had a lot of different discussions with a variety of different members. One of the blessings, I guess you could say, is that several of members of our Republican delegation either served in the House or the Senate previously, so I know all of them. And obviously, in my current role, I've gotten to know the rest of them. And I do think, again, I think it's an area where everybody identifies that, yes, there's a problem. Where they disagree is, what exactly is the definition, which is what Conor and his group are trying to work through, and appreciate that effort. Look, I know that bipartisanship is not easy because we lived it for all of last session when we worked on some very, very tough issues. And that focus will work itself out in the group, whether they settle at 600 million or 1.1 or 2 billion or trillion, excuse me, that's going to be, where the rubber meets the road, where the work gets done. And it's important that they focus on that. I've expressed, our concerns, because look, a lot of the folks that are currently in DC were here when we debated the gas tax, so they know what the original plans were in terms of using that should the federal government ever take action. And I think it's something that, while we have steadily climbed up from the bottom where we were previously ranked when we passed Act 89, the truth is there's still a lot of work that needs done.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I move to Representative Kail, I wanted to come back to the congressman. Are there any Pennsylvania congressmen other than yourself who are part of this problem solvers caucus?
Yeah, I think we might actually have the most of any state. We have Brian Fitzpatrick, Chrissy Houlihan, and Dan Muser are all part of it.
All right, so that's 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats.
Mm-hmm. And Brian is now the Republican lead of the whole caucus. So he's tops among the Republicans.
Good. Thank you for sharing that. Representative Kail, let me just ask you the same kinds of question about Washington. Do you think, from your perspective, do you think compromise is possible? And then I want to turn to both you and Brian again about the state of Pennsylvania and what the General Assembly is doing. But let me ask you the broader question on the national level.
I sure hope so, John. I think that this is something that's absolutely critical that Washington does tackle. Frankly, I think it should have been done before. I think the last administration missed an opportunity to really handle the infrastructure issue. Throughout the summer of 2020 and throughout the rest of the year, it would have been a great time for people to be out there working on infrastructure projects. People weren't driving on the roads. There was less activity happening everywhere. It would have been an excellent time to really take advantage of that. With that being said, I think it's imperative that we do move forward with a plan. Everything in our area in our state needs upgraded. Conor noted that that Pennsylvania is at a C minus. I think it's important to note as well, however, that we're still in the top 15 or something in the United States. So it's not just Pennsylvania, it's across the entire nation. And it would have been a great time to do it. And it is a great time to do it right now. Our economy depends on it. Our progress depends on it. And I think it's a really important that we do come together. And I think that this issue is something that the nation needs in a broader sense. It's an issue that isn't so, excuse me there. It's an issue that isn't so hot button. It's an issue that I think there's broad consensus among people, among my neighbors, among people I talk to. And I think would really cool things off, the political scene. It would cool the political scene off quite a bit. And I think that would be very helpful as well. You can see Republicans and Democrats working together to accomplish something good for everybody. So I think it's a must do, and I hope it does get accomplished in a reasonable way.
Well, let me ask both you and Speaker Cutler about Pennsylvania and whether or not there's a specific effort to address infrastructure needs in Pennsylvania that go beyond tolling our bridges in order to repair them, which, as you know, Josh, has been very controversial in this area, tolling a bridge on Interstate 79. Brian, you correctly mentioned, was it Act 89? You go back to the gasoline tax. This happened during the Corbett administration, I believe, and obviously pumped a lot of money into infrastructure repairs, needed infrastructure repairs. A bit controversial because of the gasoline tax as a funding mechanism. But I think most people have recognized that it was necessary and needed. But you talk to the PennDOT officials today and they tell you it wasn't enough. It's not enough. They need a whole lot more. And I guess from your perspective, assuming for a moment that we continue to have deadlock in Washington, and I'm, as with everybody here, let's hope that's not the case. But assuming that we don't get much out of Washington for a while at least, is there something that should be done specifically in Pennsylvania? Mr. Speaker, I'll start with you, sir. I don't know what legislation is in the works beyond this notion of tolling bridges in order to make repairs. And by the way, let me just pass on to folks again. In about somewhere 5-10 minutes or so, we'll turn to questions. So if you have questions you want to post in Q&A, please do so, and we'll pose them to these great panelists. Mr. Speaker, go ahead. Pennsylvania specific.
Sure, John, and thank you. Yeah, we had identified infrastructure even after the passage of Act 89 is needing continued improvements. Last session, as Majority Leader, I had appointed Select Force on Transportation, and they had issued a report under the leadership of Martina White, and it had representatives from all regions of the Commonwealth that were serving on it. They had worked with industry stakeholders. So yeah, there's a lot of different proposals. There was, I'm going to say 12 or 15 bills probably that came out of that report that were introduced last session. I know they're going to be looked at again this session. Obviously, COVID and specifically the loss of the consumption or the gas tax was a huge hit on transportation funding. However, PennDOT had also flagged the decreasing revenues because of increased fuel mileage standards. They had flagged that as going to be an ongoing issue. The reality of that is that's the closest that we can get to a consumption-based tax. Typically, the more you drive, the more you pay. What we didn't want to do is what some states do, like Virginia, that has a personal income tax on your car, where and I'll use my own grandmother as an example. She lived alone, and she would drive her car basically to the grocery store and church twice a week. That was it. And the idea of charging her several hundred or even $1,000 or more for a registration fee or a personal income tax in the car just didn't make sense. So we went with the consumption base because if she didn't drive a lot, she wouldn't pay a lot. The problem, though, is one, we've got the electric vehicles, which are supposed to voluntarily remit payments into the system. They do not do that on the same frequency at which we all pay gas tax. So we did look at some additional areas there as well. I think that, by the way, you can increase their fees as well as build out their infrastructure at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive. And so we did have some other ideas and areas that we were looking at. Some of it was with permitting reform. Again, when you've got to wait 2 years to do projects, that's a problem. And you would think that PennDOT, one branch of the government working with DEP, the other branch of the government, would be able to work through those issues. But the truth of the matter is they've got a lot of struggles themselves internally. So they need to streamline that so that we can, the term that we always use in this world, it seems, is shovel ready. It does no good to be shovel ready if the paperwork's not ready. So we need to make sure that they can get things moving, and we can have a whole host of good ideas. And if and when Conor and the individuals in Washington, D.C. come up with a different infrastructure plan that would supplement what we're already doing here. We've got a lot of good ideas and where we could focus it. And that report was pretty wide ranging. And it wasn't just roads and bridges. It dealt with rail, it dealt with mass transit, it dealt with ports. So I think that those are all areas which we've already talked about this morning that we need to continue to stay focused on.
Well, you're quite right to point out that the gasoline tax has really become a bit of an obsolete tax, particularly as we move to more and more electric vehicles. And the fact is, and more fuel efficient vehicles, you just are not raising the revenues that I think PennDOT and others might have expected a decade ago. And so the question is there an alternative tax? I've read a bit about the mileage-based tax, which essentially taxes a vehicle on the number of miles driven, which is a user fee. It's a user fee. And it seems to me, since we all get our cars state inspected every year, when they check your car, they just take down the odometer reading and send it off to Harrisburg, and you get a bill in the mail based on your mileage. It sounds to me very easy to implement. I know that there's concerns that I guess some of those inspection systems might fail in some ways or cheat or whatever, but and there are talks of electronic devices and people concerns about privacy and the like. So I know there are lots of issues involved, but is there a thought in Harrisburg, Brian, to replace the gas tax? And by the way, you need to replace it. You got to get rid of the gas tax. You don't add on another tax. You get rid of one in place of another. At least that would seem to me to be the politically expedient way to go. Is there talk of that at all?
There has been some talk, John, but you actually highlighted all the concerns. The big one being privacy, in terms of, our tractor trailer drivers already do this. They apportion their mileage based on where they drive. And in order to do that effectively, I think there's some very valid concerns about having tracking devices in your car and driving around. I'm like you, though. I mean, you go in once a year and you get your mileage checked. It's a condition of your insurance renewal as well. If everybody remembers, for those of us who still do it on paper, you have to put your mileage in without the tents, of course, but you still put that in. Right. And so we are tracking the amount. I can't imagine it would be that difficult to figure out a usage fee based off of that. I always use myself as an example. When we passed Act 89, I used to drive a Ford Explorer. And as we had kids, I switched from a Ford Explorer to driving a Honda Accord. I literally got twice the mileage out of a gallon of gas. So, even though I was driving the same amount, the fuel tax per mile was actually decreased. And it's something that we're going to have to grapple with and work with as we go forward, because in a lot of ways, not only our transportation and our infrastructure system, our tax laws and a lot of the other permitting laws are all based in the middle of last century, and it's time that we catch them all up.
Yeah, good. Josh, let me give you a chance to respond on the Harrisburg side. Do you think there's something Harrisburg should be doing with respect to infrastructure right here in the state of Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I think you highlighted the exact issue that we got to be talking about. And I know we are talking about it out here is how do we go forward to collect revenue for infrastructure? I mean, the last year was obviously a big problem for the gas tax because people weren't moving as much, but really that's going to be an issue going into the future anyway, as we get more electric vehicles and as people get more efficient cars. The gas tax hasn't been performing as well since its inception. It's continually gone down, and so we need to really figure out a way to put a system in place where we can make sure that it's based off of consumption or usage, but at the same time that it's fair, that it's not too burdensome for people. So the devil is going to be in the details of what the numbers are, what the percentages are, how we actually go about having people pay for it. But this is a discussion that is actively being had. I know that there is a workforce in our caucus that's talking about it, but there's also with the governor, with the chairs of the transportation committees, is having active discussions with outside stakeholders as well as to how to do this best. It's an issue that I think everyone recognizes needs to be dealt with, and it will be dealt with. It's just when will it be dealt with, and how much infrastructure will we be behind because we haven't dealt with it soon enough.
Right. Thank you very much. One last question from me before we turn to questions that have been posed. Energy. There are a lot of folks who believe that the Biden administration is engaging in or will soon engage in a war on energy, a war on fossil fuels, a war on the type of energy that we have here in Western Pennsylvania. Now, I interviewed Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm the other day, and I could tell she walks a pretty fine line on this subject, but saying that there is a role for fossil fuels in Western Pennsylvania. She was pretty clear about that with me. But nonetheless, we've got lots of organizations and folks who are engaged in fossil fuel development, natural gas for one, in this region, that care very much that there's a future for fossil fuel, to say nothing of the unions and the individuals who work in this industry. So I'm going to start with you, Congressman, and just run through the three panelists about what is the future of fossil fuel development in Western Pennsylvania, well, throughout the Commonwealth, since the speaker comes from Lancaster, throughout the Commonwealth. And are you at all concerned that the Biden administration may make it difficult for the natural gas folks or for others who are engaged, coal and others, in fossil fuel development? Congressman, your thoughts?
I think it's a strong future, particularly as the economy rebounds this year and next year. It's going to drive up demand. And it appears that Western Pennsylvania may actually be gaining an edge over some other parts of the country that produce, because we really produce only gas. In places like Texas and New Mexico, they really produce gas as a byproduct of their oil production. And, the price of oil really plummeted during the pandemic. So it shut down a lot of the production on their end, whereas gas up here has stayed a little stronger. So I think that we're in for a couple of good years. The rig counts are slowly creeping up again. I think that for the longer term future, it is incumbent on all of us to work together to preserve this industry if we want to, and I believe we can. But one of the reasons that I've been focused legislatively on finding ways to reduce methane emission, the just gas that kind of leaks out of the infrastructure along the way, is because I actually believe that threatens the long-term health of the industry. That is often characterized as a regulation that is burdensome on the industry. But I think that for natural gas production to survive and maintain the support of the American public as a whole, they have to show that they are not making the problem of climate change worse. And so far, the transition from coal to gas in broad terms has been a net positive for climate change. That's why I think a lot of people in my party are wrong to criticize gas in the terms that they do. But we have to take care of the methane issue. And many of the companies have set methane reduction targets. They understand that it's crucial to their future because people will not put up with that. So I think if we can get those two things right, we have a positive outlook ahead. I can say from firsthand, talking to the president, his staffers, the people who are influential here, there's nothing to be concerned about. They believe in smart regulation, of course, and they believe in being a watchdog, but they understand that natural gas will continue to be produced in Western Pennsylvania. He has said it dozens and dozens and dozens of times. So have so many people that work for him. There are some people who will just never accept that, and media members like yourself who will continue asking it as if it's an open question, but it really is not. So I think that we have good days ahead of us.
I interviewed Joe Biden 4 times during the campaign, and every single time he wanted to reassert that he was not going to unilaterally shut down fracking in Western Pennsylvania. So you're right. I asked the question because he wanted to answer it over and over and over and over again. But let me just ask Representative Kail, since he comes from this area, are you concerned about the Biden administration with respect to energy policy in this area?
I sure hope that he's supportive of the energy industry. And I think the questions that you ask are warranted, judging by some of the comments and positions that he held during the presidential primary. I know politics is politics, and what some people say in the primary might be different what they believe or what they say in the general, but it's still very concerning. Look, I think that there is a dramatic false dichotomy that is really hurting where we're going with natural gas. The idea that we have to pick between our environment and our jobs is ridiculous. It's 100% ridiculous. The natural gas industry provides benefits for both, dramatic benefits for both. And I think if we don't promote and celebrate the industry and really try and get and leverage the most out of it, all you're going to do is be driving demand to places like China and India, where there is no environmental regulations. Because we're not going to stop buying cell phones. We're not going to stop using plastic products. The demand is still going to be there for consumption of natural gas. The question is, are we going to be doing it here in Pennsylvania or in the United States where we can do it right? Or are we going to be letting other nations benefit from us, running our companies out? I think that is absolutely important for the future of our country, but also for emissions and things of that nature as well, that we do continue to promote the natural gas industry. I think we're starting to see in Western Pennsylvania anyway, more of a consensus building. I've worked very closely, and I know Conor works very closely as well with our building trades here. We have labor and industry coming together on this issue and saying, hey, this is something that we can do here. This is something that's right for our area. I would like to see the environmental community get more on board with what we're doing here, because to be quite frank, and I tell Penn Future and other environmental groups that I talk to, one of the reasons that we should have a petrochemical build out and a natural gas build out in Western Pennsylvania and in the United States is because they're here. Because they're here to oversee and to investigate and to see what's happening and to advocate for a clean environment. Whereas with those individuals were to go and protest a facility in China, they'd probably end up 6 feet under. And so when we have people that are overseeing and looking at the industry and holding the industry accountable, we have the workforce that wants to work in Western Pennsylvania, and we ought to be celebrating this industry as a positive for our economy and also for our environment, because it is. Factually, it is.
Representative Kail, thank you, sir. Let me turn now to Speaker Cutler. Do you have concerns at all about energy policy with respect to the Biden administration?
Well, actually, my concerns are a little broader, and that's just with the market in general. And I think that Conor actually hit on this a little bit, and that's this. If the energy market demand is up, which I agree, I think we're on the cusp of, a multi-year increase. I think that's great. The problem going to be, though, as long as prices stay suppressed, other forms of production may not be as profitable or even make sense economically. We saw that in our nuclear industry. I know locally here in South Central PA, we saw, 3 Mile Island, they're in the process of decommissioning. I know that there's some discussions out your way regarding some plants in Western PA and the central part of the United States that have been impacted. And part of that is driven in large part by the market economics of the energy industry. Specific to the fossil fuels, though, I do think nationally, we need to recognize that natural gas is what allowed us to hit our climate goals years ahead of schedule here in Pennsylvania. That's something that I'm not sure they get enough credit for. Two, we also need to recognize that it has to have a place in the future going forward, because it's an integral part of the baseload component. We saw what happened in Texas with the wind and the solar when the wind wasn't blowing and the sun wasn't out. So you've got to have some baseload backup there. I think natural gas is a natural place in conjunction with nuclear and some of the coal-fired plants that are still left that have the clean technology. So I do think the fossil fuels really will play an integral role going forward, just because despite some national efforts by some interest groups to push us faster, the truth of the matter is these plants don't get built overnight, and we need the reliability that comes with the fossil fuel industry.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm now turning to the Q&A function, which folks are free to throw in any questions they have, and I can just read some of these questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but let's just we'll get started with some of these questions. I don't know if the panelists can see them or not, but we have talked about funding, but I do want to ask a quick question on the federal level. Well, somebody is asking that this is not just an infrastructure problem, but a funding problem as well. The president has proposed increasing the business tax, not back to where it was before President Trump's bill was approved by Congress, but maybe halfway up. I think it was, is it 24% to 28% corporate income tax?
21 to 28.
21 to 28, as opposed to, it was what, 33 or something?
35.
35. So do you think, is that the kind of compromise that members of the problem-solving caucus can accept, or is there another funding mechanism that you're looking at?
We're looking at sort of multiple funding mechanisms, I think, to try to tie together a bundle of proposals that could get you in the $1 trillion to $2 trillion range. I think that so far the Republicans have not been real warm to the idea of going from 21 to 28 on the corporate rate. And their response, the other part of Biden's proposal really has to do with trying to discourage the outsourcing of jobs and profits to other countries by trying to tax them on what they do when they move their operations to, Bermuda or the Lesser Antilles or someplace that we know they're not really doing business. So that may survive. I think, you can look at Senator Manchin as a pretty good bellwether of where a compromise might be. And he said that he could see the corporate rate going from 21 to 25, which from a lot of accounts was mostly what the corporate community actually asked for under Trump. And then Trump being Trump, sort of went even below what they were asking for in very bold, dramatic terms. So there's possibility there. One of the proposals that we're looking at in our group most seriously has come from Larry Summers and some academics who say that if you actually gave some more resources to the IRS without changing the tax rate one bit or changing a single law, they could probably collect about $1 trillion or more in tax revenue over the next decade that currently goes uncollected because the audits are so complicated at the top of the scale for corporations and wealthy individuals, they just can't do it. So we're looking at seeing if we can get that math right. If you invest $100 billion in the IRS, can you make $1 trillion back? And then you noted a little bit, John, the issue of user fees, vehicle miles traveled for cars where the gas tax is a declining source of revenue. There's a lot of interest in that, particularly on the Republican side, that if you're the one using it, you're the one who should be paying for it, whether you drive a gas-powered vehicle or an electric vehicle. And I think the thing we're trying to figure out is whether that should be done in sort of a pilot project format where individual states get incentives to create a VMT of their own. That might help us solve a little bit better some of these execution issues related to do you put technology in the car or is it part of the annual inspection rather than having kind of a one size fits all. So that's what I mean when I say there's probably 3 or 4 funding streams under discussion for us right now. And we're just, kind of trying to see where we can get on a compromise in an old fashioned kind of way.
Great. Thank you, Congressman. That was very helpful. I'm just going to toss out a question and anybody can answer it unless it's specifically directed. And again, we have so many questions. Do we have the trained workforce to establish infrastructure, the kind of new 21st century infrastructure that we're talking about? Anybody want to tackle that? Do we have the trained workforce?
I'll jump on that one because workforce development was a big issue for us last session, John. We had an entire package on career and technical education, as well as a lot of just what we actually took to calling gold collar jobs. Those jobs which don't require a college education, they might require some level of specialized certification or education that involves hands-on. And I'm saying this as somebody who also went to a trade school. I went to a 2-year trade school right out of high school. And while we have the foundations for a good workforce, we need a lot more recruits. Because if we get the infrastructure investment like they're talking about in Washington, D.C., plus what we could do here at the state level, we're going to need even more people in these fields. So while we've got the good foundation and a good starting point, it's going to take some continued investment for many years to come. Because as the congressman pointed out, this investment's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a multi-year rollout. So the good news is we've got the time to build up the workforce to the level that we need. And we need to just stay focused on that and make sure that we keep putting those supports in place, both in terms of the state and federal budgets.
Good, thank you. Public-private partnerships. I mean, this came up with respect to the PennDOT proposal, the idea that you would essentially allow a private company to toll a bridge in exchange for the fact that they're going to do rapid-fire reconstruction of a bridge. Is this the most efficient and successful way of doing, say, bridge replacement or other infrastructure projects? Do you think there's a role for public-private partnership? Anybody want to take that one?
I can jump in on that. I'll answer the one regarding the bridge in particular, because it's right down in Bridgeville. It's not far from where I don't think it's a good idea at all. And if you look at that bridge in particular, there's ways around that toll. It's not very difficult to get around it if you take certain exits. It's going to cause traffic issues in Bridgeville and Heidelberg and other places because people aren't going to want to go through that area. And it's just, I don't think when you're thinking about a single mom or a dad or whoever just has to get to work every day, and they got to go through that bridge, and it's just, they keep getting nickeled and dimed every time they go across that bridge. It's just, I don't think it's the right approach. I don't think it's appropriate. I think we should be looking at different ways of funding. There is a place for public and private partnerships. I think we could work there. I think it's an important thing for government to pick up on some of the efficiencies within the private industries. But I just don't see this as a mechanism for really long-standing transportation funding.
Congressman, this question was directed to you. Does the Problem Solvers Caucus include expansion of natural gas distribution? I mean, is that part of what you're considering as a component of infrastructure?
I think that our report right now does not specifically talk about natural gas pipelines, but one of the things it does talk about is trying to speed up and make much more efficient the environmental review project or process for big infrastructure projects, which would include pipelines. That's in fact, usually one of the main obstacles to getting a pipeline built. So indirectly, I guess the answer is yes.
Got it. Okay. Nuclear power. None of us have mentioned nuclear power, and yet we do have some nuclear power assets in Western Pennsylvania in particular. Anybody, do you favor adding nuclear power, the questioner is asking, to the state's alternative energy portfolio standard?
John, that's actually something that we debated earlier, and I referenced it with the TMI closing here in South Central PA earlier. The issue with adding it to AEPS is the fact that so much of our nuclear power is used right now for baseload, that if you let nuclear power itself into AEPS, it would actually take away from all of the other sources that are there. There have been several proposals that would have incentivized it, but ultimately I think it's a market problem where they can produce consistent energy, but at a slightly higher rate. We just need to recognize, and for me personally, I view this really as a national security issue. You need some diversity in the grid to ensure that the reliability will always be there. Whether it's cold, whether we have another polar vortex, whether there's a gas line pipeline disruption. I don't think we should be overly reliant on any one source of energy. And I think the best way that we can make sure that nuclear power companies stay open is to make sure that the market prices are competitive and can cover their costs.
Got it.
Yeah, John,
go
I
ahead.
would just add to that quickly. We're trying very hard to get help for nuclear energy from Washington as well. And, you know, there's discussion of the Biden administration trying to propose some sort of national carbon-free energy standard, which maybe we could try to fit nuclear energy into to try to help them, you know, capture some return for the benefit of carbon-free that they provide. But I would add it's really a national security issue twofold. One, for the reason that Brian mentioned, but secondly, there's at least $1 trillion export market for nuclear technology available overseas. And Westinghouse used to fill most of that for a lot of our history. And now Chinese and Russian firms are. And so we're really losing out there because Pennsylvania actually, I think, has the highest number of nuclear manufacturing companies like a Curtiss-Wright, but others kind of all over that make all the parts in a plant. And they can do a lot of business overseas and make a lot of money and create a lot of jobs here back home. But the more we let our domestic industry decline, the less likely we are to be the ones providing nuclear energy in Africa, for example. And so we're trying to make a sizable investment in preserving the existing fleet and kind of capturing the next generation of advanced nuclear reactors. But it's an issue that is almost more regional and geographic than it is partisan in Washington. It kind of is based on who has nuclear energy in their district and knows about it. So that may allow us to have a breakthrough in the end because there's kind of an even number of Republicans and Democrats that care about this on both sides. It's just not quite enough to rise to the top of either one.
Thank you. That was good. Thank you. Representative Kail, we've had a couple of questions about the Energy, Commerce, and Innovation Corridor and how best to apply. I guess this can be both Representative Kail and Congressman Lamb. You know, how best can we make sure this region is part of the infrastructure plan and get with support from the federal infrastructure bill for the ECIC in this region? Representative Kail or Congressman Lamb, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that, you know, this is going to sound overly simple, but I think we need to be strong advocates for this region for projects. And I know Congressman Lamb is a strong advocate for infrastructure projects here. And I think it's just important to explain that we're not just being homers, though we do care deeply about where we're at and our constituents, obviously, but the job growth and the potential for this region is in the state of Pennsylvania, I think the top region within the state for growth. And that's a big deal for the entire state. We need to maximize it. We need to make sure we get the most out of it so that, you know, for future generations, there's more tax revenue, there's more ability for the states and for even the federal government as well. I mean, we can get more bang for our dollars here in Western Pennsylvania, I think, than we can in most other parts of this Commonwealth.
We have run out of time, and yet we have some wonderful questions. I'm wondering if I could ask our friends at the Washington County Chamber of Commerce, who, by the way, deserves lots of thanks for helping to set this program up, if they could record the questions, and would the lawmakers allow us to send them these questions and you could respond to those questions that might be pertinent to your areas? Would you be willing to do that? Because we do have, in the cases in which they're identified as individuals.
Yep, absolutely, John.
Yeah, and there's some very good questions, and it's just hard to get to everybody when we have a 9:30 cutoff time, which we do have, and we have reached. And Jeff, are you able to come back on and say a word or two, or shall I just wrap up?
Can you hear me, John?
We hear you loud and clear, my friend.
It finally worked. I won't make it. Well, there I am. I just want to thank Congressman Lamb, Speaker Cutler, Representative Kail. Really appreciate you taking the time today. It was really great to hear, I think, from a perspective of just a citizen, that we can have federal and state lawmakers, different parties, in general, agree on many things that are very important to us here in the state and the country. So greatly appreciate that. On behalf of all of us at Pittsburgh Works, I want to thank you for taking that time. And John, thank you for being our moderator. Did a great job, and we greatly appreciate that.
Well, thank you all, everybody. Thank all the folks who have listened in on this program. We really appreciate that as well. And again, I'll just add my thanks to Congressman Lamb, Speaker Cutler, and Representative Kail. It was great to be with you guys again. Thank you for your honest and forthright answers to all our questions. Have a great day, everybody. Stay well, stay healthy.